There we go. Once this recording is available, we will send a video link to everyone who's registered. If you have a question during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or type it into the chat. I'll be reading out questions to our presenters at the end of the presentation. You can also use the chat box to make comments and talk to other attendees. Just be sure that you are sending to all attendees and not just panelists if you want everybody to see your message. I'd love to hear, our chat's already been pretty active so far, and I would love to hear where everyone's joining us from tonight. So feel free to share that in the chat as well. Joining us for this presentation is Rick Fair and Christopher Larson. So Rick is originally from Wallaceburg. He has a PhD in environmental studies and has published research on the environmental history and folklore of Baldoon. He's also co-authored a biography of Jawana Benesi, an Ojibwe chief who lived at the forks of the Sydenham River in the early 1800s. Christopher Larson has a PhD in history focusing on how science, religion, and nature converge around things considered to be supernatural. He has published on the historical significance of the Poltergeist phenomena and published on the events of Baldoon and how people have interpreted them. They will be discussing the Baldoon Mystery tonight, a well-known story detailing Canada's oldest and most widely reported poltergeist. The events detailed in the story happened in late 1829 and early 1830 and have been subject to great folkloric interest. Numerous plays, short stories, and novels have focused on the plight of the McDonald family at the hands of unforeseen forces or unseen forces. Although the events have captured popular imagination, little serious historical analysis has been done on the mystery. Yet, the archival record reveals fascinating insights about the events that transpired in early Sombra Township. The details of the Baldoon Mystery are strange, yet many of the historical facts are equally compelling. Rick, Chris, thank you both for joining tonight and to discuss your research on the events surrounding Baldoon. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you guys take it away.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And thank you, Nicole. Nicole is a good friend of mine, and as an archivist is a hero among historians. The work you do is amazing. And we're here for Archives Awareness Week, and Christopher and I really wanted to talk about a passion that we hold for the Baldoon Mystery. So you're all sharing where you're joining us from, and I think that's great. And I do want to acknowledge my hometown, Wallaceburg. Some of you may know Wallaceburg in Baldoon, and nearby Wyoming, where Nicole is joining us from, is Anishinaabe territory. So the Three Fires Confederacy, or the Three Fires Council of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations call Wallaceburg, Baldoon, and Wyoming home, known as Pekajwanong territory. And historically, that's their homeland, and it's still their homeland today. So the Baldoon settlement is famous for two reasons. The first reason Baldoon is famous is the collapse of the settlement itself. And this happened shortly after it was founded by Lord Selkirk in 1804. Dozens of settlers died from malaria and exposure in just the first few months after they arrived from Scotland. And this is a history that has been thoroughly documented. Lord Selkirk himself took copious notes and wrote them in journals, all of which are available at the archives facilities in Ottawa and in Gatineau, Quebec. As well, his farm manager, Alexander McDonald, also recorded copious notes, something like 9 journals. And these journals really became the basis for the history that is known about the Baldoon settlement. So historians like Fred Coyne Hamill, J.M. Bumstead, John Morgan Gray, and Lucille Campy, they wrote these really excellent historical books, and PhD theses, master's theses, all on the history of Baldoon. But the second reason Baldoon is famous is the reason why we're here tonight, and that is the Baldoon Mystery, a series of unexplained hauntings that happened in 1829 and 1830, roughly 20 years after the settlement collapsed. Unlike the collapse of the settlement, though, this history hasn't been well studied or published on. And perhaps the reason why the hauntings haven't been given serious treatment is because they just appear so fantastic. So just consider some of the common reported occurrences. The sound of marching footsteps could be heard at all hours of the night in the home of John T. McDonald. Stones thrown through windows from unknown sources. Mysterious balls of light setting fires through the McDonald home. Household objects flying from their resting place and striking nearby occupants. And coins appearing to materialize in thin air before falling on the breakfast table. Of course, these are just the common occurrences. There are also witness accounts of a menacing black dog who appeared in smoke of a barn fire, and a stray shape-shifting goose that was said to be a witch, and the craft of witch doctors who made quite a scene trying to bring peace to the community. So all of this seems well suited for the work of folklorists, but maybe not historians. Enter Christopher. You've done extensive historical research into these topics, poltergeists. How do historians study something like the Baldoon Mystery?
Yeah, well, with any historical case where weird things happen, like in the Baldoon Mystery, there's always this intersection between what people report directly experiencing and then what they say about that experience. So first of all, what counts as direct experience in the historical record? In Neil McDonald's interviews of 26 people, which we should note were conducted about 30 or 40 years after the Baldoon Mystery, we have at least 10 people recounting how various stones and lead balls that were marked and then thrown into the river. Now, by marked, I mean each person made a distinctive mark. It's not said in the Baldoon Mystery how they made the mark, but perhaps it was by etching it into the stone or into the lead. Then after throwing the stones and lead balls into the river, mysteriously, they flew back into John McDonald's house, soaking wet as if they'd come fresh from the river, landing right at witnesses' feet. And this happened over and over again. Now, of the 10 people who recount this happening, 5 of those people directly said they saw this for themselves. In fact, they marked the objects. And then 5 people reported hearing other individuals tell them about seeing this happen, in total 10 different individuals. As strange as this sounds, this weird account accords with some similar incidents from other historically documented poltergeist cases. For example, I can think of one in France in 1615, or another one in Miami, Florida, 1967. Very similar types of things. So while we can't say how something like this happened, or for that matter, prove that it happened, we can say multiple people historically reported it, or they recalled a family member or some other individual telling them about it. Now, that's the kind of work Rick and I do as agnostic historians. And I don't mean agnostic in a way that relates to religion, but as a method to use when things are hard to explain, methodological agnosticism. Now, since the events haven't been proven or resolved, rather than have an opinion on what the events were, methodological agnosticism allows us as researchers to be neutral. An agnostic historian can examine controversial events from many angles while leaving questions open around things that aren't resolved. And the other layer I mentioned is what people say about that experience, their explanations. That's where the suspicions of witchcraft gained traction in Baldoon. What people in the past say about their experience helps us to better understand how they saw the world in which they lived nearly 2 centuries ago. So let's think a little more about that context for a minute, because beyond the folkloric qualities, there are these historical qualities. When the Baldoon Mystery was happening in late 1829 and early 1830, suspicions about witchcraft were a common part of Christian settler life. Witches and the devil were commonly blamed when people encountered recurrent flying objects, spontaneous fires, or strange noises. And this is evident in other European and colonial poltergeist cases from around the time of the Baldoon Mystery. And it goes back to the medieval period that people have these types of concerns about these strange events when they happen. There's a historian, Owen Davies, who in his 2016 book, America Bewitched, documents witchcraft beliefs in North America in the 19th century through to the mid-20th century. His compilation of court cases shows how the Baldoon Mystery really fit into a time where rural people in particular believed in witchcraft. Now remember, in the Baldoon Mystery, there's this idea that there were tensions between neighbors around land ownership. This is a theme that pops up in the Baldoon Mystery. In 19th century North America, on occasion, tensions blew up to where one person was accused of cursing another of witchcraft. Witchcraft accusations often arose around people's dislike for each other. Another thing to remember is that even though large-scale witch trials had waned by 1750, there were still some witch trials and even executions that occurred within the lifetime of the Baldoon settlers. Only 20 years before the Baldoon Mystery, and not so far away, near Columbus, Ohio, in 1810, the Wyandot chief Chateauronia, known to settlers as Leather Lips, was ordered executed by a tribal council, in part for witchcraft. But there was more going on there. Chateauronia's kin saw him as a traitor for selling land to settlers and failing to support Tecumseh's Confederacy. So perhaps the witchcraft charge obscured these more political motives for executing Chateauronia. But charges of witchcraft would have resonated with Indigenous people and settlers alike in 1810. So from this, you can see it's not so outlandish how Neil McDonald wrote that a witch's curse was central to the Baldoon Mystery in 1829, 1830. Many of the European settlers at the time were steeped in concerns about witchcraft, much as their ancestors had been when they suffered misfortunes. So what any researcher needs to be careful about is explaining away events and what people said about them as being pure folklore, imagination, or tall tales. In both the events and how people recount what happened, no matter how fantastical they may seem, there's a lot to be found. Discounting them would be a disservice to building a historical understanding. So again, both what people report directly experiencing and what they say about these experiences, they all count in historical research. And our job is to be agnostic, to try to neutrally understand why things unfolded the way they did and why that matters. Now, Rick, as questions of witchcraft were raised in and around Baldoon, there's one community member who found himself in hot water over suspicions he was a witch doctor. And I'm just wondering, can you share what we found about this?
Sure. And as I share what we found, I'm also going to share my screen for a couple of minutes because there is a couple of slides that I do want to show with this. So the reason the Baldoon Mystery is famous is because of Neil T. McDonald's story by the same name, which relies on a wealth of oral stories from both settlers and Indigenous peoples. There were 5 Indigenous witness accounts, some of which were gathered by Neil T. McDonald, but some of which were also shared with Reverend Peter Jones, who was a Mississauga missionary. Now, these stories came from a wealth of oral traditions from each culture, so Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And what Neil T. McDonald does is he really puts into sharp focus a lot of the memories of these community members who witnessed the events at Baldoon in 1829 and 1830. And Christopher and I, what we've been doing is kind of stepping away while acknowledging Neil T. McDonald. We've been casting a broader net to see if there were any other contemporary accounts of the events in the community. And sure enough, we did find a little known set of documents that we think completely reframe or at least add more context to the Baldoon Mystery. And I'll show you just an example. So this here is a letter that was written in May of 1830 by a man named Robert Barker. He was from the township of Sombra, and you see there, you might see the Western District, and he was a schoolmaster. So this was a headmaster of the school in Sombra. The letter was addressed to Sir John Colborne, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And Barker's letter and the series of documents that accompany this actually detail a trial. And the trial was against Robert Barker, and it was for pretending to practice witchcraft. And you can see it says attributed to witchcraft. And Barker's talking about events here that were believed to be caused by witches or were the source of witchcraft. And Barker himself was attempting to put an end to what was happening. Now, he was arrested with pretending to practice witchcraft, which is different from practicing witchcraft because it's a fraud charge. And that would have been laid against someone if they were accused of duping somebody into giving them money while offering a spiritual solution. And it's actually, it has been a crime in Canada up until 2018. In the case of Robert Barker, he was performing hexes on the homes of John T. McDonald, his father Daniel, and a man named Hector McDonald, who was an uncle of John. Now, these documents, they offer some critically important new insights into the events of 1829 and 1830. I'll just outline two significant details. One, they show that more than one household was subject to the hauntings. And this is something that we see in poltergeist cases before the 1850s, where a whole community or certain parts of a community can be subject to these events. But perhaps more importantly, these are the only documents to have a sworn affidavit from John T. McDonald, the man who is often at the center of the Baldoon Mystery. Now, interestingly, McDonald's affidavit doesn't offer any accusations against the schoolmaster, but instead portrays Barker's hex work as being a much needed intervention into his family's troubles. McDonald stated that he approached Barker and asked him to come to their aid, and that Barker refused any financial compensation. McDonald details that over the course of several weeks leading up to and following Christmas, Barker performed a series of incantations at his home and the homes of the others. And the schoolmaster was nailing these upturned horseshoes as a sign of auspiciousness and good spiritual fortitude and good luck, we might say now. He was nailing them above the doors of these homes, along with a letter that was put in a sealed envelope, which would have a hex written on it, and then the name of the witch would be on the paper. So he did this for some time, but none of it worked. The events continued to plague the families. So then Barker claimed to have a conversation with spirits from the old country, who were distant relations of the McDonalds in Scotland. And Barker told John McDonald that a woman from their homeland, familiar with John's father Daniel, was the source of their misery. And the matter concerned an unresolved real estate transaction back in Scotland. But it doesn't end there. Barker continued with the evolution of his story and then pointed to two women in the community who he said John McDonald was familiar with. By now, however, it looked like Barker's own standing in the community was suffering because word was getting out. He was doing these, what I imagine would have been very theatrical performances, and he was accused of being a blasphemer. So as word of his hex work spread around, the magistrate from Sandwich, nearby Windsor, was alerted, and Barker was arrested, put on trial, and convicted of pretending to practice witchcraft. And as part of his sentence, he had to spend 1 year in jail, and he had to stand in pillory. This is standing in pillory 4 times throughout the year from daybreak till noon. So that was his sentence. Although his letter to Sir John Colborne was successful, and the lieutenant governor did grant him some clemency. So I think it's fascinating that someone like Robert Barker was responding to something that the people in Baldoon were alarmed by. Spooky manifestations that they reported witnessing over and over again for weeks by that time. And I'm sure many people here are wondering about poltergeist events themselves. Christopher, can you tell us about what people reported seeing in the Baldoon Mystery and how that relates to how people have reported this strange phenomenon across history?
Yeah, you know, the poltergeist phenomenon is very, very strange. Clearly, I've been studying it in historical context for 15 years now. And these events are so unusual, but they're physical events witnessed by many people across hundreds of documented cases. So even if you feel doubtful that these physical events actually occurred, the historical record is clear. These reported events affect people, their communities, and cultures. The Baldoon Mystery actually has even become a big part of Wallaceburg's founding story. The reason why I've been working with Rick on the Baldoon Mystery is because the qualities of the weird manifestations reported by settlers and Indigenous witnesses are overall consistent with what I've studied in my research into 20th century poltergeist cases. So, you know, a whole century later, very similar types of phenomenon are reported. But the effects of the poltergeist on people in the early 19th century are really different, as is evidenced in the prominence of the settlers' ideas of witchcraft. To compare Baldoon to other historical poltergeist cases, let me very briefly focus on the materiality of the weird things witnessed at the Baldoon settlement and how they accord with other historic cases. So one common manifestation in poltergeist cases, strange noises. Many poltergeist cases feature strange noises, and there are strange noises in the Baldoon Mystery, sounds of marching footsteps in the McDonald home, as Rick had mentioned at the top of our presentation. And when family members investigated, they couldn't find the source. The witness, L.A. McDougall, called staying overnight in the McDonald home and hearing, quote, a rumbling noise over their heads. Again, no idea what caused it. Now, other historically reported poltergeist cases feature a variety of strange noises. Most common are knocking or tapping type noises, and sometimes these strange noises are very soft, and sometimes they're extremely loud. Now, the word poltern actually means to make a loud noise or an uproar, and geist means ghost. So you get a sense that the poltergeist has often been associated with strange noises as well as causing an uproar. Now, another kind of manifestation are the strange movement of objects, and these are the most commonly featured in the Baldoon Mystery. Types of movements really vary in poltergeist cases. Objects falling from heights, sliding across surfaces, flying from a stationary position across the room, floating in the air as if levitating. Small objects move, but also really big, heavy objects have been reported to move, like beds, like heavy wood frame beds, and wardrobes. So as if that wasn't weird enough, objects sometimes reportedly emerge through solid surfaces, like doors and ceilings. So we have such things reported in the Baldoon Mystery narrative. Objects were said to fly through the solid boards that have been put up over broken windows, or fall through the solid ceiling. If you can imagine an object just appearing from a solid surface like a ceiling or boards over a window, almost as if matter had passed through matter without leaving a mark. The third big feature we see in the Baldoon Mystery are spontaneous fires. Now, spontaneous fires aren't actually as common in poltergeist cases as moving objects and strange noises. In the present day, there's a poltergeist researcher in Australia named Paul Cropper, who is specialized in studying such spontaneous fire cases in Asia and Africa, which gives you a sense of how global these strange occurrences are. When spontaneous fires alight, it's rare for the level of property destruction reported in the Baldoon Mystery to actually occur in most poltergeist cases. In Baldoon, entire buildings reportedly burned down. John McDonald's house burned down. Outlying farm buildings burned down in these spontaneous fires. Most of the time, in fact, I can't think of another case where that's happened, where an entire house is burned down. But generally, people are able to contain the fires quickly enough to prevent that level of destruction when they do occur. A few other common qualities in poltergeist cases to consider. One, time. Poltergeist events tend to last only a few weeks or a few months, but rarely longer. Recurrence. These physical events occur repeatedly again and again, not necessarily every day or at the same frequency, but they do recurrently occur, different kinds of manifestations. Spontaneity. These manifestations tend to occur surprisingly, without warning. Therefore, the events are really hard to observe. It's kind of like looking up at the night sky and waiting for a shooting star to go across the sky without knowing where it's going to happen or when. That's how elusive these manifestations could be. And as such, people who experienced the poltergeist reported feeling like they're being taunted or harassed, almost as if by a bully. So, an invisible bully in your home, throwing things around, making strange noises and lighting spontaneous fires. Now, unless outright fraud has been discovered, as occasionally has been evident in documented historic cases, poltergeist events end as mysteriously as they began. And that leaves those who experienced the events with a feeling that there was no resolve. Or, as with Neil McDonald's family narrative of the Baldoon Mystery, they blame it on a witch who is stopped from her accursed behavior with a silver bullet. So when faced with a lack of resolve, they sometimes build a story to explain things. What matters to me as a historian is that in all historic poltergeist cases, people reported seeing something that was very strange to them, something that stood apart from their normal everyday experiences. And how people tell us about these experiences and what they thought of them tell us more about who they were and how they understood their world beyond their ordinary lives. Now, I don't know about you, but just recalling all those different poltergeist things, it kind of makes me feel a little spooked. It's almost like history itself can be haunted. Archival documents have upset the narratives that have commonly been accepted as the truth. And we've also discovered that documents can trick and mislead us into questions about who was at Baldoon. Now, Rick has been spending a lot of time looking at a lot of documents, piecing together the story of John T. McDonald, the man at the center of the Baldoon Mystery. Can you tell us about the haunted history of this farmer?
Sure, Christopher. So, John T. McDonald, when we first started this research project and we first started writing the book, I thought, okay, we really need to shed some light on who this person is, John T. McDonald, because his farm and he was so much at the center of the troublesome activity. If he had any other name, this task would have been so much easier. But his name itself, it's Old Farmer McDonald, right? It's an everybody name. If he was American, he would have been John Bell or John Smith. If he was British or if he was Spanish, it would have been Juan Perez. It's one of those names where it's an everybody name. So the task at first, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to touch this. I'm just going to pretend that John T. McDonald is, we all know about John McDonald. But the more I started looking into this, and with the help of Nicole, I was really intrigued. I thought, whoa, no, maybe there's something there. There's something about this everybody person that actually makes it an endearing part of the story. So we were able to actually chart some basic information, not of one John McDonald, not of two John McDonald, but I'm going to share the screen here and I'm going to show just how many John McDonalds we were able to locate. We were able to locate possibly up to 11 different John McDonalds, all living within the Baldoon area, either on Walpole Island, either on the St. Clair River, either in Wallaceburg. There were so many of them. Although we do know that John T. McDonald, that's Taylor, John Taylor McDonald, is the center of the Baldoon Mystery. So we have that middle name. That Taylor indicates that they were menders of clothes. They made clothing for the settlers. So John Taylor McDonald, he was the prominent one. But there was also a John Piper McDonald who also came across from Scotland with John T. McDonald. And it doesn't help that both John Piper and John Taylor both had fathers named Donald McDonald, although there was Donald Piper McDonald and Donald Taylor McDonald. So those were the two John McDonalds who lived, you know, probably just down the stream from each other for many decades. But there was also a William John McDonald, who was one of the first settlers. He came from Prince Edward Island, and he was a troublesome character who was actually arrested when he took over as the farm manager because he was interfering with courtships among the settlers. So there was a scandal there among another John McDonald. And you can see there was a younger Glengarry John McDonald, whose parents were unfortunately killed. They were among the first settlers as well. And he, as a young boy, was put into indentured servitude down in Amherstburg. So this was a tragic story about this younger John McDonald. There were also some John McDonalds on Walpole Island. There was an Indian agent by the name of John Keating who identified a troublesome Scot by the name of John McDonald, who he wanted to forcefully evict from Walpole Island in the late 1830s and early 1840s. There was an old John Scotchman living on Walpole Island as well. And then we see number 10 and number 11, some possible, well, definitely a John McDonald who died in 1942, but was born in 1869. So there are so many questions about John McDonald. And this to me speaks to a haunting in the archives where you think you have an answer about who somebody is, but the more you look into it, the more you find that this isn't just one person, but there are many different characters by the same name, and they all offer a rich layer or rich layers of narrative into the story, not just of the Baldoon Mystery, but of the place itself, the cultural interactions, the social interactions, the misfortunes, but also their lives. So what started out as being this very arduous and difficult task actually became this very wonderful vignette of who the many John McDonalds are. All right, I'm just going to stop sharing that for a second and look to see where I'm at. So, Christopher, archival research on the Baldoon Mystery, that's why we're here. We spent a lot of time in some of the regional archives, and of course we had great assistance from Nicole. We're still asking Nicole for help. Yes. We used digital archives in Ottawa, as well as scoured so many different online publications and newspapers from the 19th century. But Christopher, you've been telling us about this bigger research project that involved people experiencing and researching the poltergeist in 20th century Britain and North America. Where did you find the materials for your poltergeist research?
Well, I think we have time to go over a little bit of what I did. And Rick, if you don't mind sharing the screen, and we'll show some slides as we go here as well. In my PhD research, I was really fortunate to visit 5 archives that contain documents pertaining to historic poltergeist cases, and some were dedicated to the collections of specific individuals. So, for example, here we see the most active poltergeist researcher, the Danish-American parapsychologist William Roll, who passed away in 2012. He donated his collection to the Ingram Library at the University of West Georgia, where he taught in the Department of Psychology. Now, when I went there, for me, seeing his raw data, his notes, his photographs, drawings from his case studies, where he actually went on site to investigate poltergeist cases, showed me the process through which he worked. We can see some of these artifacts from the archive here from the aforementioned 1967 Miami case, and see how he mapped out the movement of objects in a warehouse where the poltergeist events were observed. You can actually see lines indicating where objects had moved from and in which directions. So very carefully, he documented poltergeist events. And that's something that we don't actually have in the Baldoon Mystery, because at the time there simply weren't experts like William Roll doing this level of observation and documentation. If we can go to the next slide, Rick. The major American collection that houses case studies of poltergeist investigations are actually at Duke University's Rubenstein Library. It has the collection of the parapsychology lab that started there in the 1930s, led by the founder of American parapsychology, J.B. Rhine, who's shown here, demonstrating an experiment involving dice being cast by this mechanical contraption that's on the table. This experiment tested if a person's intention for the dice to fall on a specific number, on a specific face, would affect the results. And you know, it's interesting because meta-analyses of many kinds of these experiments over decades have shown small scale, but statistically significant evidence that human intention affected matter. So that more dice would actually land on the face intended by the person sitting there. This is nothing quite like the very dramatic physical manifestations in poltergeist cases that we've been talking about, but the experiments sought to understand a potential relationship between people in poltergeist cases and the physical manifestations that happened around them, what's called psychokinesis, or PK. Now, in the archive at Duke, there are some thoroughly documented poltergeist cases. And I actually love the juxtaposition of this house photo with the one we started with at the beginning of our talk. You can actually see a house that was afflicted by poltergeist events in Seaford, Long Island in 1958, which featured this archive actually features letters that were sent by people who had all sorts of theories as to what was causing the events. So here we have one author of a letter taking a Life magazine clipping with the photo of the house in that case, and suggesting there's someone standing in the lit window who may have been murdered and needed prayers. So you can see a more spiritual explanation here, very different than the ideas of psychokinesis with the dice machine that Rhine and his colleagues were proposing. But such letters really gave me insights into the ideas that the public had about the poltergeist phenomenon in the 1950s. On the next slide, just very quickly, I also went to England. There's many archives there. The major organization that has studied and discussed the poltergeist phenomenon is called the Society for Psychical Research. It was founded in 1882. They actually have their own library at their offices in London, but their entire archive, which includes well over 500 poltergeist cases, are held at Cambridge University Library. And I just wanted to show something from one file, a case that occurred in West Yorkshire, England in 1936. We can see a newspaper clipping here about weird noises occurring in this house. And they did create a floor plan, but didn't indicate in this particular floor plan where things were happening. So floor plans were a common way that investigators would really show the measurements of the house and try and understand the house as a material place where these things were occurring. Now, from these archives, I also actually went to the University of London Senate House Library, also had different archives of poltergeist cases and experiencers. 5 different archives I went to for my PhD research, and I collected 25,000 images of documents, which is more than enough for many, many lifetimes of research, as you can well imagine. Now, of course, these documents helped me to complete my PhD dissertation and actually continue to use them in my work, including for the project Rick and I are doing. Let's look at one more slide. Beyond the poltergeist, beyond these 5 archives I told you about, there are all sorts of other phenomena that people have studied and experienced, and that you can find documented in archives all across North America and Europe. And I suspect there are archives in Latin America and Asia as well that I just haven't heard about. So the kinds of things you could find in archives, if you're interested: poltergeists, ghosts, and hauntings; psychokinesis, that's the idea of affecting a physical environment or outcome through conscious intentions; near-death experiences; survival of consciousness after death, that's when people talk about what happens after we die. And of course, people report encountering deceased loved ones in various ways. Out-of-body experiences, different kinds of altered states of consciousness; telepathy, that's when you know what another person is thinking when they're not there with you; remote viewing, that is seeing places and things that are a long distance away. There's a whole US government and Soviet remote viewing program, for example, during the Cold War. Precognition, which is having knowledge or receiving information about the future, for example, through dreams. Also, if you love UFOs or cryptozoology, which are things like Bigfoot, which I know Rick loves, you can find those kinds of things in archives as well. So this map just gives you a little bit of a taste of how there are archives in Canada at the University of Manitoba, actually, in the US, Holland, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Sweden, as well as the UK. So there may be others with which I'm not familiar, or smaller collections held at smaller research institutions. So on top of those physical archives, there are tons of digital archives online. The newest archive of all just opened at Rice University in Houston, Texas. It's called Archive of the Impossible. So clearly there's much to be found in archives for those wishing to explore extraordinary topics. And there you go. I think that's a good way to sort of cap off the presentation and think about Archives Week and how there's something really big out there that Baldoon is part of, that our regional history is part of.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. And yes, that is it. We did want to create some space and allow some time for questions. So if folks were sharing questions in the Q&A, Nicole, did you want to speak to that?
Don't have any questions yet, but I am certainly, please feel free to share your questions either in the chat or the Q&A. And there's one already. That's wonderful. Melissa asks, is there any activity there now?
Well, I'll tell an anecdote. Maybe local people would have something to say about that neither Rick and I know about, but I will tell you that when I first did an article on the Baldoon Mystery, a local historian and reenactor, Don Mudford, was touring me around the historic site where Baldoon settlement was. And the whole, I hope I don't spoil it for anyone who hasn't read the Baldoon Mystery, but the whole climax is literally about a stray black goose that people felt was a witch, actually a shapeshifter. The witch was a shapeshifter who transformed into this goose. So this witch doctor, John Troyer, who's from Long Point in Norfolk County, instructed, well, craft a silver bullet and then shoot this goose and the Baldoon mystery will be resolved. So that as the story goes, John McDonald crafts the silver bullet and shoots the goose and injures it, and it swims off into the marsh with an injured wing. And then John McDonald marches down to the long, low log house where the witch is said to live. And there she is, nursing an injured arm as if she had shifted back into human form and had an arm injured by a bullet. So I wrote this actually in the end of the article I wrote in this magazine in Britain called Fortean Times, recalling how Don and I, and actually Henry from Wallaceburg Museum, Henry Van Doren, we were touring that area. And I remember Don and I were just standing on the side of the road near where the McDonald's property was. And there are a couple of dogs barking at us across the road in the front of a house. And we're kind of laughing about it because one of the dogs was black. And there's a black dog that appears mysteriously in the fire in the Baldoon Mystery. So we thought it was kind of, there's an irony to that. But to top it off, the owner of the house came out and his arm was in a sling, in a black sling. Just, you know, the synchronicity there was really strange. It was just like the injured arm of the witch in the Baldoon Mystery. I thought that was the perfect close to my visit to Wallaceburg in 2013 when I was doing the research. So I don't know if there's anything active right now, but that little story is one of my favorites. And it does sort of speak to how there's something to be said about the Baldoon Mystery's perseverance.
We have a couple other questions. So the exact location, I would say an accurate location would be McDonald Park along the St. Clair Parkway. When you're heading north on Highway 40 from Wallaceburg, you pass by McDonald Park, and that marks where the McDonald homestead was located, and that's Daniel's homestead. So John McDonald's homestead, which burnt down, was a bit further south, and Hector McDonald, whose house was also haunted, was actually on the north branch of the Sydenham River in Wallaceburg. So multiple locations, but the famed location, which was Daniel McDonald's home, was where McDonald Park is currently. Another question from Laura: how did the house burn down? There's any number of theories about how the house could have burnt down. From Neil T. McDonald's account, it was from the witness accounts, these mysterious fires that would be set. And one of the Indigenous witnesses actually said that he had spent the better part of a day putting out fires, which would drop from the sky from what he described as balls of light no larger than a hickory nut. They would just fall from the sky inside the house. And he said you would pour water on it and the water would act no different than oil and the fire would spread. So again, that's part of the lore. So there's a lot of theory, but no definitive cause.
Yeah, and those are all great points. The fires could also just kind of pop up all over the place at any given time. One of the witnesses talked about it popping up 10 places at once. So, you know, they were definitely on their feet trying to extinguish these fires, and the whole community would gather and try and fight these fires. They were so frequent. I mean, these are very common accounts that we see from people who witnessed it. So yeah, like what caused the fires is a really good question. But they certainly were very active throughout the Baldoon Mystery, more so than other poltergeist cases involving spontaneous fires that I've heard about.
So there's another question. How close was John's house to the river or the stream for the rocks to be thrown?
So Daniel's house, I guess, well, Daniel and John's house, they would have been very close to the river. I'm not sure precisely, but within throwing distance for them to throw the stones into the river and then have the stones thrown back. And there are images of a contemporary home that burnt in 1930 that is often used or was often used as the Baldoon house, even though it wasn't it wasn't Daniel's home. It was further south on Stewart Line. This house also, it looked to be about maybe 40 yards from the river. So if that's any indication, perhaps the home of Daniel and John was also about that distance away.
Thank you, Rick. Tara asks, I heard stories about hot rocks being left in a baby's bassinet. Is this true?
I can speak to that. Yes, indeed. One of the witnesses recounted a hot stone under an infant in a cradle. And the stone, when thrown into the river, quote, the water sizzled In a minute, the stone was thrown into the room, and this act was repeated several times. So this is one of those incidents where a stone was thrown into the river and then flew, literally, it seemed like it flew back from the river into the house. There's not really, let me see, cradle. There's, of course, if you go to the Wallaceburg Museum, it has a wonderful effect of the cradle rocking, which is one of the scenes in the Baldoon Mystery, where the cradle is rocking by itself. But yeah, those are the two accounts in relation to the cradle that occur in the Baldoon Mystery.
Thank you, Christopher. Glenn asks, what happened to John T?
Well, John T, I believe he lived until about 1861. So the interesting, there was no a phenomenal thing as far as we know that signaled his death. But the one interesting thing that happens is after John T. McDonald passes away, that's when Neil T. McDonald starts to cultivate the collection of stories, which is interesting because the stories were gathered in the 1860s. It's as if he waited for his father to pass away before he started speaking to people. And why would that happen? Why would you wait so many decades until the center of the story passed away? And the only reason I can think is perhaps John didn't like talking about it. And it could have been a source of embarrassment for him. And there are some notes in Neil T. McDonald's story toward the end that justify, like, see, this is why he acted the way he did, creating such a ruckus when John Troyer came to visit, shooting perhaps at sigils of a goose, perhaps shooting at a goose itself that was black, or doing some sympathetic magic to bring it to an end. That would have been, for somebody, a good Christian back then, that would have been a no-no. So I don't think John really wanted to talk about it, but that doesn't stop other people, right? So, but after he died, that's when you see the stories collected.
Thank you. As Renee wrote, you guys should write a screenplay about the Baldoon Mystery. And there's another, we have time for a few come in. Is there any suspected reason why this phenomena occurred in the area of the failed Baldoon settlement?
You know, Rick, maybe it's a good spot where we could talk about Peter Jones and what he collected from Chief Bashagweshagwam. And I have it in front of me if you'd like me to read that.
Please.
I think that's a good. So Peter Jones, Rick had mentioned, Mississauga missionary. He went around and he interviewed Indigenous elders, and he wrote an entire book on the history of the Ojibwe. And he was in conversation with the powwow chief, Pashagweshagwam, of Walpole Island. And I'm reading from Jones's account. Jones writes, I asked him what he thought of these strange occurrences among the white people. He replied, oh, I know all about it. The place on which the white man's house now stands was the former residence of the Memengwesewag, or fairies. Our forefathers used to see them on the bank of the river. When the white man came and pitched his wigwam on the spot where they lived, they removed back to the poplar grove, where they have been living for several years. Last spring, this white man went and cleared and burnt this grove, and the fairies have again been obliged to remove. Their patience and forbearance were now exhausted. They felt indignant at such treatment and were venting their vengeance at the white man by destroying his property. Jones continues, the old chief uttered these words as if he fully believed in the existence of these imaginary beings and in their power to harm those who dared to disturb their habitations. I mean, that's a really, I think for both Rick and I, one of the most fascinating accounts of a reason why these things happened at the failed Baldoon settlement. Rick, do you have any further thoughts on this?
I do, and I would say the other part of our research is the lore and the storytelling traditions, the indigenous Anishinaabe storytelling traditions, the Pennsylvania Dutch storytelling traditions, and the Scottish storytelling traditions. So these three traditions intersect in the Baldoon Mystery. And in the Scottish accounts of what was happening, there's this large black dog. And there's particular stories from the Isle of Tiree, where the McDonalds come from, where there's a fairy dog that is a large black dog. So these are now two different accounts, a Scottish and an Anishinaabe account, where these beings have either an invisible presence, but a presence nonetheless in the story. And at some point, when Christopher and I were having one of our conversations, I said, wow, the Baldoon Mystery really reads like a fairy tale, but without any fairies. So Neil T. McDonald doesn't want to mention little people. It comes from Gagagwanabe, Peter Jones, and Bashigishigweshigum talking about little people from the Anishinaabe tradition. And I speculate that the reason why they don't talk about the fairies is because they were entering the modern age. Neil T. McDonald, it was the Industrial Revolution. There were steamships going up and down the St. Clair River. So why would you talk about these little spirit beings when you can say it's a witch? So those are just some of my thoughts.
And that's interesting you mentioned the steamboats, Rick. There was an earlier question, why doesn't Wallaceburg publicize the site of the mystery? And I mean, since the Baldoon Mystery, there have been various ways in which Wallaceburg has publicized it, from Neil MacDonald, the son of John MacDonald, writing the Baldoon Mystery, originally serialized in the local newspaper and then published and bound as a book. But like Rick was saying, I mean, the river itself was the site of not only steamship traffic, but there are tourist boats going up and down the river, and they would recall the Baldoon Mystery, including local historians like Frank Mann and Alan Mann. They would recall these stories, and it goes into the Selkirk History Fair to this day, where a reenactor like Don Mudford does, and going to the to the Wallaceburg Museum and seeing the Baldoon display. So there are ways in which they publicize it, as well as if you go to McDonald Park on the edge of the Shania card, you see there's a plaque there about the Baldoon Mystery. There's various, the Black Goose statue, for example, in downtown Wallaceburg. I think the Black Goose mural, is that still there? I seem to recall maybe it's not.
I think it was blown up. Or erased.
Okay. So, I mean, there have been many ways, but I mean, in terms of a bigger sort of publicity, as happens in some places, I think of Salem, Massachusetts as an example. We don't have a Ripley's, believe it or not, museum in Wallaceburg yet, but I suppose that could be a business opportunity in our post-pandemic times, or sort of endemic times, as you might say.
Thank you. Question from Andy: with the river being involved with some of these incidents, did any of the witnesses allude to there being an entity or force in the river itself?
Not that I don't think I've ever recalled any lore about entities or forces in the river. How about you, Rick?
No, not that I recall, at least not from the settler tradition. There are from the Anishinaabe tradition, but they're not directly connected to Baldoon from what I hear. And I see someone, Laurie McDougall, is saying that this is her family. This is fascinating because we have so much respect for the story and for all of its complexities that it's good to see that some of the descendants are actually with us tonight.
Absolutely. Wonderful that you've joined us, Laurie. And it is such a rich story. It just seems to give and give. You know, there's always more to be found. I think that's for me, one of the surprising things, because as I mentioned, I wrote a magazine feature in 2020. It was published in 2014, and Rick had also published on it. And you know, when Rick and I started to say, we should write more about the Baldoon mystery, I thought, yeah, you know, this is a very rich historical event to expand upon, but I really couldn't have fathomed the amount of material that has been so insightful and new to our eyes. So yeah, very fascinating. Absolutely, down the road, we've been talking about interviewing descendants and talking to more local people as part of our work. So we've been gathering a lot of our research. So yeah, it's definitely an opportunity to connect with people and learn more about what they might have to offer in understanding more about the Baldoon mystery and the descendants' stories.
Thank you. It is a little after 8, but we do have one more question. One last question for the evening. Did anything happen to the lady down the street they believe to be a shape-shifting witch?
That's a great question, Rick.
Yeah, well, this is a really good question, and we don't know who this person was, and there was a certain point in our conversations where I said to Christopher, if a woman was shot, so a goose was shot and then she appeared with her arm in a sling, if a woman was shot, it would have made the news. This was at a time when newspapers would say anything. They would publish extensive stories on any misdemeanor. So not much happened without it not getting a lot of attention. So one of the things that we did see is in the 1930s, there was a riverboat captain who shared his iteration of the story. It was with a reporter from the Toronto Globe. And he said that it was the school teacher and two accomplices from Michigan who were the source of the mystery. And I was like, oh, okay. So there's speculation even a century later that Robert Barker was the suspected cause. But we see that Neil T. McDonald treated Barker with sympathy. He was a sympathetic person in his mind. So for Neil T. MacDonald, it became this woman. And Robert Barker attributed the cause first to a woman in Scotland and then to two women who were known in the community. So who the source was, we can't say for certain, although there is lore around the source, the suspected source itself. I like to think that there was some sympathetic magic occurring. So John MacDonald may have created a sigil, and I had mentioned this briefly, may have created a sigil of a goose on the orders of John Troyer, and then started shooting that with lead bullets. And then an opportunity came where he saw a goose that was a reasonable approximation, and then shot this. And then perhaps they saw somebody a short time later with their arm in a sling, and poor person, because then they would have been blamed for everything that happened. So, there's no definitive, we don't have definitive answers, but a lot of speculation and lore has been built around this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, both Chris, Rick. This was absolutely wonderful. I think we'll cap it off for the evening. We've had some awesome comments in the chat. We've had some great questions asked tonight. We've a very engaged group. So thank you everyone for joining and participating. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Again, thank you so much, Christopher and Rick. You got a wonderful presentation and very intriguing, very interesting content and research that you're doing. I look forward to seeing what else is to come.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It was fantastic to have you. And thank you, Nicole, for all your work and the work of your colleagues to make this happen tonight.
Yes, and I'm echoing that as well. And it's great to see such a great turnout. So once again, thank you, everybody.
All
Have a good
right.
night, everyone.
Have a good night.